Great. Thank you very much, Kurt, and thank all of you for coming, and a special thanks to the Prime Minister for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us for this conference and to follow what was a terrific and very impressive panel that we have with both party leaders. The Prime Minister is just back last night, I think, from Yerevan. And Mr. Prime Minister, if I can, let me start with taking a bit of a regional perspective and look at the situation in your neighborhood where there have been serious protests in the country you just visited. Serious protests in the country you visited in Armenia. Apparently there are protests here too. Azerbaijan, where there's a referendum coming up on amending the constitution to tighten the grip there, developments in Turkey, of course, elections in Russia, which we could not have had a panel like we just had here in Tbilisi. How does Georgia survive in this kind of neighborhood where there is lots of turmoil and we don't see building democratic trends in the region?
Thank you, David. I would like to thank the organizers of this event. I am very pleased to be here to have an opportunity to speak about the prospects of the region itself and in Georgia, of course. Yes, I was in Yerevan yesterday. We had very interesting discussion. As you know, Yerevan is, Armenia is a member of customs union, while Georgia has different foreign priorities, and we have deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, and one of the main issues for discussion is how to combine these two different regimes for Armenia, because we are very much interested to stay in the liberal trade regime with Armenia, and this is a big issue to deal with a lot of technical issues in order to maintain the high volume of trade and to maintain the trade and economic relations as high as it was traditionally. We have around $500 million trade volume with Armenia, so we are very much interested to stay in the same liberal trade regime with Armenia. So this was one of the main issues for discussion, but of course the regional stability and how to maintain the stability was an issue for discussion. We are very glad that the riots in Yerevan ended up finally, and it's stable right now, although we of course discussed the issues in Karabakh, and we are very much interested in the peaceful resolution of this conflict. The several days before, I had also official visit in Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is a strategic partner for Georgia in trade and energy routes, and of course Georgia is a country who is deeply interested, vitally interested in maintaining stability in this region. We live in a challenging environment, I agree with you, and also recent events in Turkey, which was a big issue for concern for everyone, and I am very happy that again a democratically elected government is still in place, and of course we support democratically elected government of Turkey, and we are very much interested in the development of democracy in our neighbors. Although we have our own agenda, which is most important for us, and this agenda is very clearly defined, that this is European integration and this is Euro-Atlantic integration. And Georgia follows step by step the most important roadmap document for us. This is association agreement, under which we are transforming our country into a Western democracy. We are transforming our legislation, our institutions, and of course, the important reforms envisaged by the deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement to transform our institutions towards European standards, to introduce new market economy institutions, and to ensure a level playing field for all the stakeholders here in Georgia. But the security issues also, security issues are basic for developing Georgia, and of course Euro-Atlantic integration stays the only solution, the only formula for establishing long-term peace in this country, and to ensure democratic development, and to ensure sustainability of the reforms that we are undertaking. And of course we are very glad that the substantial package that was granted by the Welsh Summit was even expanded further during the Warsaw Summit, and we have additional elements to ensure better defensibility of Georgia, defense capabilities of Georgian military, and the deeper engagement of NATO partners in building Georgia's defensibility. And I'm very glad that tomorrow we are hosting North Atlantic Council here in Georgia, which is another proof of engagement of our Western partners in building democracy in this country.
So yesterday, if I understand correctly, a committee in the European Parliament voted on visa liberalization for Georgia, and Johannes Hahn recently said he expects visa liberalization for Ukraine and Georgia before the end of this year. How would you assess the progress that Georgia's been making in its efforts to deepen integration with the European Union? Let's start with the EU, then we'll move to NATO a little bit.
I think after having deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with European Union, it is vitally important to allow Georgian people to move freely to European countries. And this is a complementary thing to our deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, as small businessmen, if they cannot travel to Europe freely, DCFTA will not fully functional. So we consider visa-free travel for Georgia as another important deliverable from Georgia's association agreement, and we are all certain about it that Georgia has fulfilled all the necessary items in our homework checklist, and that we deserve to be granted visa-free travel. I am very hopeful that even earlier than what Commissioner Hahn anticipates, Georgia will be granted visa-free travel. And I am very grateful to Libe committee yesterday that they gave a green light to further discussions of Georgia's visa-free travel. I hope very much that it will be possible to get visa-free before the full implementation of snapback, so-called suspension mechanism. But this is again an issue for further discussions. It is vitally important, and believe me, I'm not saying this because of my party's corporate interest, but in order to boost the pro-Western spirit in Georgia, it will be crucially important to deliver this result before the elections of 8th of October. It's crucially important, again, for boosting the pro-Western spirit and for preventing anti-EU forces to campaign over this so-called temporary failure or suspension or whatever. And also, I haven't mentioned, you mentioned Russia and elections, etc., etc. I should say that, of course, we are interested in normalizing relations with Russia, in finding longer-term solutions. We are interested to decrease the tensions in order to improve the stability picture and predictability in this country. But there cannot be any compromise, or we cannot and will not concede in our main strategic issues. And the main strategic issues are clearly the territorial integrity of Georgia, its sovereignty. When we say sovereignty, of course, we mean sovereign decisions of Georgian people and Georgian nation to follow Western path. And there cannot be any changes in these decisions, since this is a will expressed by Georgian people many times through different pollsters or referendums. So this is, but again, we want to send the messages to Russia that we should not engage in another confrontation, and we should avoid any kind of further complications, especially military complications in these relations, and because this can be disastrous not only for Georgia but for the whole region. So our policy today can be called a survival policy, as I mentioned with you many times, and of course the tourism and trade relations can be viewed as a lubricant in these relations in order to decrease the tensions and in order to prepare ground for longer-term solutions, of course, with the engagement of our Western partners.
So in talking about NATO and the EU, there of course is the element of Russian propaganda that claims that neither Euro-Atlantic institution is delivering for Georgia. And in part that may be a factor contributing to a slight rise in support for pro-Russian parties. How do you address both the Russian propaganda that is a daily occurrence here in Georgia, and how do you respond to the pro-Russian parties who would say NATO and the EU are never going to let Georgia in, therefore we may as well make the best of it with Russia?
Well, first of all, I think that the power of pro-Russian political establishment in Georgia is a way to exaggerate it. I don't think that the support of pro-Russian moods in Georgia is material enough to make any serious impact on Georgia's development trend. But of course, we should not neglect this factor, and we should address it properly. And what we are doing through our strategic communication campaign, led by Minister of European and Euro-Atlantic Integration, David Bakradze. David, with his team, has traveled to all the regions and villages, leading this dialogue about benefits and about importance of Georgia's European way and Euro-Atlantic way. And I think he was quite successful in doing that. And I think that, again, we should not neglect the Russian propaganda, but at the same time, we should not exaggerate the potential material impact of pro-Russian political forces. We can see by various polls, some of them we can trust, some of them may not be trusted fully, but all of them shows that pro-Russian political forces have no material impact on the public opinion and the political process in Georgia's development trend. But again, this does not mean that we should not engage in dialogue to normalize relations, and we need to show and send the signals all the time that we don't want confrontation, but at the same time, we should send the signals that Russia should not expect Georgia conceding in its strategic priorities.
Do you see Russian efforts trying to influence the outcome of the upcoming election? In the United States, there was the headline on the Washington Post website that U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies are looking into Russian efforts to influence the upcoming presidential election in my country. How heavy-handed is the Russian role here?
You know, just mentioning several incidents just very recently, we know that Russians have enormous impact on so-called governments of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we know that just a couple of months ago, a Georgian guy was killed on the occupation line, so-called administrative border, and the killer who was shot by the camera during the assassination, he is still at large. So we can definitely see that, of course, this process has a negative impact on the image of the government and on the ruling party or whatever. Daily arrests of ethnic Georgians near the occupation line, even not crossing the occupation line, but just chasing their cows or sheep and just collecting timber or whatever, and keeping them for a couple of months in the prisons. Of course, this is a process of undermining peaceful development of Georgia and undermining stability in Georgia. Of course, they can handle these issues, but unfortunately, there is no solution to these issues, and we can still see these people, poor people, ordinary people arrested every day, every week, and Russian propaganda, and of course they are interested to have influence in this region, and we are not saying that they lost the strategic interest in this region, of course, but this is up to the government of Georgia, and not only the government of Georgia, but the whole political establishment in Georgia, how to mitigate those risks and avoid serious implications of this influence. And I think that until now, we have managed to handle the main challenge, and this challenge was to, on one hand, to consistently approximate European Union and to consistently reform the country towards better European Western standards, to approximate NATO standards by our military, and on the other hand, to ensure, let's say, enough stability for Georgia in order to keep going towards Europe and towards NATO. This was the main task, and I think that that main task has been achieved by this government, which is, I think, very good.
You talk about the energy relationship and the energy situation here in Georgia. As you know, there's been some controversy about outreach with Gazprom. Give us an update on where all of that stands.
Georgia has exceptionally good relations with Azerbaijan, and we have excellent relations, excellent cooperation in the energy field. We have Southern Caucasus gas pipeline, which is being expanded right now by BP, which will give additional volumes for Georgia starting from 2018. And until then, we have, again, relations with SOCAR, which is a government-owned energy company in Azerbaijan, which is the main provider of gas for Georgia. We have gas transit pipeline crossing Georgia from Russia to Armenia, and we get 10% of the transmitted gas as a transit fee, which of course replenishes the deficit for Georgia's energy supply, but the main provider for energy for Georgia is Azerbaijan. And of course we have rich hydropower resources, and currently around 1,500 megawatts of additional hydropower is under construction. I'm speaking under the construction, the 1,500, but 2,400, 2,500 is contracted under the memorandums of understanding, which will be built in the future. So I think that Georgia can see its energy balance very stable and very favorable for economic development, for future economic development. And of course, we will stay engaged with Azerbaijan under these strategic energy routes. There is no ground for speculations about establishing strategic relations with Gazprom, about alternative energy supply, because we already have very favorable terms with SOCAR and its strategically important for Georgia to maintain these relations, as we have seen in the past many times how the Gazprom gas was used in political purposes.
Let's come back to the election and talk about the role of the media. By the number of cameras here, the number of journalists, there is certainly a vibrant media in Georgia, particularly compared to some of the other countries in the region. There is anticipation, however, about the Rustavi 2 case. There has been talk about pressure on some other journalists. Give us your impression of where the media issue comes into play here.
Thank you, David. It's very important for us to ensure free media space, and freedom of expression generally is crucially important for our government. Anyone in this country can notice big change during the last years in ensuring free media space. Last year we completed, and we are the only country in this region who was managed to complete the digital switchover process, where we have no longer licensing requirements for new media channels or new TV stations, and it only takes, according to the legislation, it only takes 10 days to go through a very simple authorization process, and there are very basic requirements just to avoid terrorism narrative or violence narrative or whatever, and any company who wants to establish a new TV channel is free to do so. Now about Rustavi 2, again I mentioned many times, and now I can repeat that. Rustavi 2 case has two dimensions. First is the ownership dimension, and we cannot and will not intervene in the court case. But there is also media freedom direction, and being in this capacity, in my previous capacity as a foreign minister, I made tens of statements supporting this channel and ensuring, proposing different instruments, by the way, to create a media board consisting by civil society leaders, NGOs, media professionals, to ensure independence of editorial policy, but not objectivity, of course. We have no goals for ensure and to intervene in editorial policy. And the clearest, best example of the government approach to ensure free media space is public broadcasting, which is much more critical sometimes than Rustavi 2 channel. And we may be disappointed by this, but we are not, and we will not intervene in their editorial policy. And if you look at the landscape generally, we can notice that there are tens, if I'm not mistaken, more than 40 TV channels right now. Majority of them are critical towards government, overwhelming majority, and of course we are fine with it. And if you look at the rankings of the recent rankings, Reporters Without Borders, World Governance Indicators of Freedom of Expression, and etc., etc., all of them shows that every year on end there is a progress in Georgia towards better freedom of media freedom, and towards better standards. Rustavi 2, believe me, if there is someone interested to keep them as they are, this is government. And we are not interested in changing their editorial policy. They are here, probably present in this room, and nobody exercises any pressure over this TV station. I think this is a row made by some of the politicians, and they may be interested to show the importance, but again, for us, the most important thing is what we already have. I will not go into the discussions what was before, and everybody knows in this country that there was exactly the same narrative in all the news reports just 4 or 5 years ago in this country, and we had virtual news reports that Russia invaded Georgia, and the people ending up in the hospitals and with heart attacks. We remember news report when Istanbul Tbilisi flight, there was accident and the people rushing to the airports, and we found out that government wanted to arrest some politician. They landed in the former military airport just close to Tbilisi airport, etc. I'm not engaged in this discussion. I don't want to spoil the mood of all these people here. I just want to make sure that everyone looks at the media space today objectively and notice the positive change.
So let me ask the last question for me, and if we have time, we'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If, depending on the outcome of the election, either you stay on as Prime Minister or someone else comes in, what would be your top 3 or 4 priorities, foreign and or domestic, in the next government post-elections?
Thank you. The main priority for us will be to provide and to increase, to boost the economic development, first of all, because all the polls, recent polls show that jobs and employment is the most important issue in the priorities of our citizens. So the main priority will be to implement the 4-point reform agenda. And this is about fundamental reforms in education system to make it more demand-oriented and to rechannel the scarce government resources into the professions which are most needed in Georgia, and to introduce dual education model in the professional education system. Second, this is speeding up economic development through further liberalization of the economic environment, and we have already passed the economic legislation which will abolish the profit tax from the next year, introducing Estonian model, and also getting rid of the Soviet legacy in tax administration through avoiding blocking of the current accounts without court decision and limiting the time frames for inspections of the companies. Introducing new pension system, introducing capital market reform, linking the Georgian capital market with one of the European platforms, and to also further developing the startup financing mechanisms which we have recently introduced. And we had 12 Silicon Valley CEOs standing here in Georgia in our Technopark and discussing and training and pitching Georgian young people, innovative young people, and financing 20 brilliant ideas of Georgian young people. And this process will go on. Introducing further the business house concept, unifying front office for individuals as well as companies. And I should mention the positive reform of the previous administration, introducing public service hall concept for individuals. And we will, of course, expand and leverage on this project through introducing unified front office for legal entities, providing one-stop shop solutions for all companies under one roof and under one digital platform. And there again, we are using Estonian experience, and we have Estonian experts working under Prime Minister's administration. And third, introducing inclusive governance concept, and it has 2 sub-directions. First is service-oriented government, which I already discussed. The second is inclusive governance, where we have already launched the Investor Council. We have IFC, EBRD, EIB, ADB, all the IFIs, and the leading Georgian business associations, American Chamber of Commerce, European Chamber of Commerce, and several ministers representing economic bloc of the cabinet, discussing all the important changes in legislation up front to avoid negative surprises for business community and important stakeholders here locally, and to improve the predictability of economic environment. And the fourth direction is spatial development, which is speeding up infrastructure modernization through changing the strategy of infrastructure projects towards shifting towards public-private partnerships, to engage private sector more, to leverage sovereign borrowing, and to boost the speed of the infrastructure projects, to improve the quality and to improve the speed. And in 4 years from now, we will deliver different Georgia, different physical development of Georgia, finishing all the important highways and important roads leading to the tourist destinations, and the first phase of Anaklia Port, deep sea port, by the way, with the engagement of American company and the Georgian consortium, most probably engaging Chinese port operator, which is a kind of replica of Georgian economic model, and the Silk Road itself will be delivered, the first phase, which will double the container transit capacity for Georgia. I think these are very dynamic reforms, and provided that we can ensure stability in this country, there is no doubt that all these reforms will be implemented successfully.
Well, Mr. Prime Minister, I know your schedule is very tight, and for the conference itself, we also have to move on to lunch. We have to feed everyone, and then we'll get back on schedule. But I just want to thank you very much for taking time to join us today. So please join me in thanking the Prime Minister.